My name is Jack Fitzgerald. I'm the co-founder of the Warren Bennis Leadership Experience at the University of Cincinnati. On this episode of Bennis Stories, I interview Mark Goulston, MD. Dr. Goulston was mentored by Warren Bennis from 2008 to 2014, the year that Warren died. During that time, they developed a close friendship, and he has a number of stories he's going to share with us today. Warren was known, among other things, for being a deep listener, a term given to him by CNN's David Gergen. That quality was one of the things that inspired Dr. Goulston to write his international best-selling book, Just Listen, as well as 8 other books he authored or co-authored. Just Listen was first published in 2009 and was dedicated to Warren with an inscription that read, "To Warren Bennis, mentor, friend, and inspiration, who taught me that when you deeply listen and get where people are really coming from, and then care about them when you're there, they're more likely to let you take them to where you want them to go." Just Listen has since gone on to become one of the top books on listening in the world and was recently listed as number 4 in the 15 best communication skills books of all time by mostrecommendedbooks.com. Dr. Goulston is also a Marshall Goldsmith 100 Coaches coach, hosts the highly ranked podcast My Wake Up Call that Dean Marion Lewis of the Lindner College of Business was recently a guest on, and is co-host of the UK health radio show Hurt Less, Live More with JJ and Dr. Mark. He was a UCLA professor of psychiatry, FBI police hostage negotiation trainer, and as a practicing psychiatrist focused on suicide prevention, and none of his patients died by suicide in more than 30 years. He's the co-creator and moderator of Stay Alive, an intimate conversation about suicide prevention, and executive producer of What I Wish My Parents Knew, and received the Shine the Light Media Award from the Los Angeles County Medical Association's 2022 Healthcare Awards. I wanted to start with a question that you brought to my life, and that question is, Dr. Goulston, what made you smile today?
Thinking of Warren.
Hmm.
I miss him, and I think about him almost daily.
I know you called him in the article where you remembered his life, your last mentor. I was intrigued by that statement. Can you tell us more about your relationship with him, how that came to be?
Yeah, so here's how it started. He mentored David Gergen, and you need to interview David, of course, for your series. And David has a son, Christopher Gergen, who's at Duke in the entrepreneur program there. And Chris had written a book, I think The Life of an Entrepreneur, and someone had said, "Oh, go have lunch with Mark." And so we had lunch, and he said, I'm speaking at this class in USC that's run by Warren Bennis and Steve Sample, the president of USC, about leadership. I think the art and craft of leadership, it was something like that. And so Chris says, come. And so I show up for the class, and I'm seated next to, clearly I'm older than everyone. So I sit next to Steve Sample, who I didn't know, but he's the president of USC. And there's Warren down there. And Warren is one of the most charming people you'll ever meet. And he's wise, and he's a little Will Rogers, but he just exudes this kind of presence that it's really special. And he didn't know who I was. And there's Chris talking. And something he didn't know about me, and you don't know about me, but you're going to know about me now, is my background was as a psychiatrist specializing in suicide prevention. And none of my patients died by suicide. And I think part of that is because the lens through which I see the world is when I'm with people, and I'll try not to do it with you because you'll start crying, is when I listen to people, I don't listen for how to make them successful. I listen for how to help them hurt less. Because everybody has hurt. And everybody runs away from it. So I'm seated there next to Steve Sample. And he says, "Who are you?" I said, "Well, I'm a guest of Chris Gergen." And he says, "What do you do?" I say, "Well, I'm a psychiatrist, whatever." And so Steve says to me, "Let me run something by you. We partner with the big county hospital. It's USC, LA County Hospital. And Martin Luther King Hospital wants us to take over with them. And they're filled with corruption. They're just filled with, bad people. And so I don't know that we want to do that." And then, and then we stopped for a moment. And I took out a card I had, I guess a business card, and I wrote on the back of it. I said, and here's a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. The measure of a civilization is how it treats those who have hurt it and those who are hurting in it. So I write that down. I slide it over to Steve Sample, and he just had the same reaction you just did. He went, I said, "It's not about the people in the hospital, it's about the people they serve." And then, I got to interview him for a chapter of one of my books. And so what happens is there's a Q&A portion of the class, and I seem to have a way of looking at the elephant in the room. In fact, I often don't see anything but the elephant in the room. That's why my dedication to hurt and lessening it, that can change the world, because people run away from hurt into, eating, drinking, being hurtful. So I ask a question, that just pivots the conversation. And Warren looks at me, and he just looks at me. He doesn't know who I am. And it's a pretty long class. And then I'm just listening for the elephant in the room. And I ask another question. Same thing happens. And then he looks at the class, he looks at me, and then he looks at the class, and he says, "This was the best discussion we've had all year."
You remember the discussion? Do you remember what was being discussed?
No, I have no, but it was probably, I have this way, and I have this kind of, and it's a little bit like Warren. It's a little bit self-deprecating. I'll say, I say, "Look, you have to take this with 2 cents. I'm a shrink from UCLA, but what do you think?" And Warren has a little of that self-deprecating charm. So then the class ends, and he comes up to me and he says, "Oh, we're going to go have pizza, up in Steve Sample's office. You want to join us?" And so I just go there, and we just had a small conversation. He was kind of, conducting the after class pizza eating. But then we followed up. I said, "Would it be okay if I followed up with you?" And then we followed up, and we started having lunches. And we'd have regular lunches, once every month, every couple months. And he was and they got to be very open, very vulnerable things where, here's a Warren story. He said, "Mark, this is probably my favorite Warren story, although I got a bunch to share with you. He said, Mark, they just did a tribute to me in Boston. And David Gergen, who he mentored, sort of ran it. Howard Schultz, who he mentored from Starbucks, was there. I think Jack Welch was there. Tom Peters was there. And we were having a lunch, and Warren looks around and he leans in. He said, I sometimes get embarrassed when people make a fuss over me. And he says, I really liked it. And then I said, Warren, there's something you don't realize about you. That the only thing that people feel more than respect for you and admiration is love. Mm. And one of the reasons people love you is that usually within a minute of meeting you, people can trust you to never hurt them. And I remember he looked at me, he said, He said, I'm getting a lot of tributes, Mark. A lot of things are being said about me. That's the third best thing I've ever heard, and I can't remember one or two right now. It's so
There's warm. That humor. Yeah.
That is so warm. And here's another story, so I'm getting to know him, and I said, Is it okay if I say to people, you're a mentor to me? I don't want to presume, I don't know if I fall into that category. You mentor some pretty big, powerful people. And he smiled. He said, I love being your mentor. And then I'll share the story that you found humorous.
Oh, sure.
So we're having breakfast. And even though behind my shoulder is a book that's done pretty well and dedicated to Warren, Just Listen. And because David Gergen said Warren's a deep listener. So we're having breakfast, and Warren has a way of making you feel more interesting than him. In fact, one of his phrases, he didn't originate it, but one of his phrases was, try to be more interested than interesting. Try to be more fascinated with people than fascinating.
I know I picked up on the one that you shared in the tribute, and he actually says this in a University of Cincinnati interview that we have of him. He says, I've always defined boredom as not being able to make the person next to me interesting.
That is that could be my favorite Warren quote.
That's such a good one.
Oh, it's lovely on so many levels. So there we are having breakfast, and he's wanting me to talk. And I said, Warren, I'm a shrink. I'm supposed to listen. I wrote a book dedicated to you. I'm going to listen to you. You talk. And he got a little, what? I said, you're not going to maneuver me into talking and you listening. Well, I said, come on, you can do this. And then he starts to talk. And after about 5 minutes, he's talking more. And he gets so enthusiastic, he spits in my food. He sprays my food. It was a spray. It was a shower. I mean, it was big. And he sees that he did it. And he sees that I saw him do it. And then he says, Mark, I think I just sprayed your food. And I look at him and I said, Warren, when people know that you're my mentor, they say, what's it like to be mentored by Warren Bennis? And I say to them, every time I'm with him, I try to absorb him into my DNA. And I think that helped Warren.
That is so funny. The one thing that you said about being with him that I really picked up on, And I know he said this on a number of different occasions that he wanted to be known as generous company.
Mhm.
I think he even said at one point that he wanted that to be on his tombstone. And one thing that you said, Dr. Goulston, that I really liked was you felt so enjoyed by him when you were
Mhm.
with him. And it wasn't for what you had accomplished professionally, but there was this sort of half-baked version of yourself that he would put into the oven until it was fully baked. And
Sure.
I just wonder if you could speak more to that, just that sense of enjoyment and really delighting in someone. I think that's something that, you know, those listening to this could really take home with them.
Well, I've got two more stories, and the second one will cover that because that might be that might be enough for today. Um, but a first story, and I think this is where we really connected, is I had arranged for him to, I guess, do a webinar, a video webinar, and cameras were brought into his home and all this, and they had pre-sold it, and I was there, making sure it was okay. And he didn't look well. I mean, he looked really sick. And still, the show must go on, but he didn't look well. And I said to the person who organized it, who had already sold everything, and it was a live thing, I said to Warren, I said, I'm not your doctor, but right now I'm your doctor. I am a medical doctor. And I said to that person, I said, we're canceling today. What? Yeah, we're canceling because I'm sending him to the emergency room. And Warren, I said, Warren, it's not negotiable. You go to the emergency room. And the other person said, but we sold these things. I said, tell them we'll have to reschedule. You're canceling today, and you apologize, and some of the people can get their money back. But my main concern is I want to get Warren to the emergency room. And he went, and he was having an episode. I don't know if it was a pacemaker or something, but fortunately it wasn't life-saving, but he needed to go to the emergency room. But I can remember that there was a part of him, he looked at me, and we'd sort of reversed roles, because when I took charge like that, there was a part of him that, didn't like that I canceled it, but there was a part of him that was appreciative that I did. And I think it shifted things. Uh, in fact, I think what his assistant once said, I don't know if it was before or after Warren died, but she said, Warren felt he could always count on you, which is a high compliment. Yeah. But I want to shift to that story that you brought up, because as he was getting, more ill, I had a sense that, he just wasn't going to be around all that long. And so when we'd have breakfast or lunch, I'd start to cry. I couldn't control it. And I was just overwhelmed. And, I'd talk through it. I wouldn't go boo, 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 but, I'm just, it's pouring down my face. And I think I did it 2 or 3 times. And, and then, and I don't know why he didn't ask me about it, but at one time I said, Warren, you may have noticed that when I get together with you, I cry. He said, yeah, couldn't help but notice it. And one of the things Warren didn't like is, because of his position, a lot of people like Warren don't like to be hit on. Oh, can you introduce me to such and such? Can you do? I never asked him for anything other than the pleasure of his company. Because to me, that was a big gift. A lot of people wanted time with him. And the fact that he did this with me was a gift to me. Never asked him for anything. And so, and again, ever the feisty and charming Warren, I said, about me noticing I was crying. I said, Warren, I've been using you. And he went like this. And then he'd relax. Okay, Mark, what's this about? And I said, there were things that didn't happen with my dad, who died years ago. And they left me a little bit scarred. And I never thought I would heal from them. I got past them, but I never got over them. And I'm crying. I didn't want to let him know that I was crying because I was sad, because, whatever. But what I was telling him was true. I said, I'm crying because my relationship with you has healed the relationship I didn't get to have with my dad. And whenever I soak that healing in, I cry with relief. And then again, he did a Warren with me. He pauses, he scratches his chin, and he said, not a bad way to use me, Mark.
I would say so. I had an opportunity to listen to a couple of different interviews that you've given, and the listening. I feel like you talk about listening and really seeing people, unlike anyone I have ever heard talk on the subjects. And I actually didn't know coming into this conversation that you had thought so much of how Warren listened that you ended up writing one of the foremost books on the subject. So I'm so moved by hearing your experiences with him and how that influenced your work. And I wonder if you can just say some more about writing that book. Just share with us some about your work with Just Listen, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, so I'm really kind of humbled by its success. It was published in 2009. Every 3 to 4 weeks, it makes it on some bestseller list that nobody's ever heard of. A month or two ago, there was a website called Most Recommended Books. You can go there, and they had a thing called the 15 Best Communication Skills Books of All Time. And Just Listen was number 4. So it's pretty humbling. And it's done well around the world, so well that I headlined with Daniel Kahneman in Moscow. He wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And I was there because 5 of my books have done pretty well in Russia. They're not paying attention to them now. And the focus of Just Listen is to listen to people in a way in which they don't just feel understood, but they feel felt. And as I mentioned in passing, I was a suicide prevention specialist, and I had a pretty good track record. And in the past few years, I've come up with a term, and I'm trying to teach it to the world for the approach, and it's called surgical empathy. Because when people are really traumatized, which eventually can lead them to depression and suicide, when people are really traumatized, they form psychological adhesions to try to survive. And an adhesion is not an attachment. You might be able to talk to an attachment, but an adhesion, it's like organs after surgery. They get stuck together. And so you need to go in with surgical empathy, because what happens is when they feel so hopeless, so helpless, so powerless, so useless, so worthless, so meaningless, so purposeless, and so pointless, they attach to death to take the pain away. And so surgical empathy is basically getting right next to them in the dark night of the soul before you throw treatments at them. And when they feel they're not alone there anymore, they emotionally kind of look at you like, what are you doing here next to me? And my approach was, you didn't look like you should be alone. So I'm just going to keep you company. And then we'll figure out treatments. And they'd start to cry. So I don't know if that really makes any sense to you.
Yeah, I think that you what I've heard you talk about in some other interviews is just this just really like looking. You talked about really looking at someone, just really seeing them.
Well, listen, see, if you listen into people's eyes,
Mhm.
and I'm rebranding myself finally with the brand I was meant to have. And if you go to my LinkedIn profile, it says hurt less, live more coach. And I'm about to co-host, and by the time this comes up, the show will be going. I'm co-hosting a show on UK Health Radio. It's the leading talk health internet radio channel in the world. It reaches 800 million people. And the show is called Hurt Less, Live More with JJ and Dr. Mark. Because the lens through which I look at the world is there's enough people looking at people saying, how do we help you succeed? How do we make you help you make money? And, and that's fine. But I just can't stop when I'm with people of listening for hurt. And how much does it hurt? Where does it hurt? And when it reaches a point where you can't take it anymore, what does it make you want to do? And so something I want to share with your audience, because I'm always learning more. And I'm going to try this with you, and you can tell me if you feel something inside you when I try this experiment on you. The last time I spoke in Moscow with Daniel Kahneman, what I said to the audience, the 1,000 Russian business people, is underneath you listening to me, you're listening for something. And if I get what you're listening for without you telling me, and I deliver on it, if instead of you listening to me and you writing down bullet points, and most of them won't work because I'm this expert and you're not, and you'll give me, and if I'm entertaining, you'll give me your mind for an hour. But if I get what you're listening for underneath that, and I deliver on that, and I get it right, you won't give me your mind, you'll give me everything. And here's the difference. Right now, Jack, you're interviewing me. So you're listening to me. And, and we're checking boxes. You have some stories you remember, that I was involved in, and you're bringing them up. And I'm appreciating that you seem to be liking the stories. But this is what I think you're listening for underneath you're listening to me. It's very important to you that when people watch this series, that you don't waste their time. It's very important to you that when people see this series, they get extreme value from it. That they get so much value, they want to find out more about the Bennis Institute. And they want more. They want to find out, who was this guy, Warren Bennis, and let's support your program. And so I think under you listening to me, you're listening for, is this an interview that could provide that? Is this an interview that could touch people? fire them, want them to find out more about our program.
Hmm.
And you're also, I don't know if this has happened yet, I hope not, you're also listening for someone you're interviewing who's awful, and you can't post the interview because you need to protect the viewers from this person who may be a so-called genius, but he or she is awful. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
that definitely hasn't happened.
because the people you've reached out to who knew Warren couldn't help but love him. So,
Right.
but
No,
I'm telling you, if you were a host of a podcast or radio show, they say, "How did you know that?" We had to delete an interview and explain to our guests why we couldn't use it.
no, I think you're spot on. I mean, to maybe open up a little bit um to you, I discovered Warren because his book on becoming a leader was given to me as a punishment in high school for coming home late. And I had no idea the turn that was going to take my life on. And I brought the book with me to college. And that's when I discovered that while I was at the University of Cincinnati, he was in fact the president there. So I I continue to do this work. I never got to meet him, but I feel a lot of the same emotions that you felt when you were with him. I feel those through the spirit, his spirit that I think lives on through his work, through the people like yourself that he knew. And I think, what I'm listening for, I think I'm listening for the people who can help to convey how special he was as a person, um, as a thinker. I love what you wrote about the people that you were going to let into your life after your experience with him. You're sort of like this transition of, I need to find another mentor, to I'm going to be the mentor. And everything, not to go line by line, but you know it just, what you wrote, who care about making the world a better world better than about themselves, making the world better than about themselves, um, who have a lifelong passion for improving themselves as people, who have a sense of humor and don't take themselves too seriously. Just having felt Warren's spirit, having talked to a number of people that got to be with him and spend time with him and feel enjoyed by him. I think with these interviews, that's what we're hoping to bring out. Um,
I have been blessed because I've had 8 mentors. They've all died.
Hmm.
And by the way, here's the way you can use a mentor, especially a dead mentor. Sometimes I can be kind of critical on myself. And, I can have an interview like this and afterwards beat up on myself. And one of the ways to use a mentor in your mind's eye, living or dead, is I can call upon Warren after this interview. I can just feel how much I miss him. I say, Warren, I don't know if I did so well. I did this interview, it's for your institute, and and I wanted it to be about you, but there were times when I made it about me. Warren, I'm not sure that I lived up to your spirit. And when I call upon Warren, he would say to me, so what did Jack think of it? I'd say, I think he was okay with it. I think he may have even liked it. And then my mind's eye, and you can all use this with mentors when you think you've messed up. He would say to me, Mark? Yes, Warren. Put a sock in it. And then he'd say, oh, one last thing. What's that? Tell Jack that I like him. Okay, Warren, done.
That's great. That's great. You know, there was something that the Harvard Business Review wrote about him that I was excited to ask you. I've asked a couple of guests, but I felt like this would really resonate with you. Just given the stories that you have, and he talked about an unfinished project because he didn't write enough, right? He didn't do enough, but he he called it the unfinished project, which so just the direct quote is, it may come that my next book will be called Grace. I think that may just be the name for a book which is going to deal with issues of generosity, respect, redemption, and sacrifice, all of which sound vaguely spiritual, but all of which I think are going to be required for leadership. I think that would be a tremendous book. I think he wrote it with his life. And that was kind of how they closed the article, was that, you know, those that knew him knew that grace, you know, if they felt what that book might have been about. But I was just curious if you had a reaction to that from him.
Yeah, I have a reaction and another story that I hadn't thought of.
Okay.
I arranged a lunch with him and the then head of UCLA's psychiatry department, a Brit named Peter Wybrow.
Mm.
And Peter Wybrow had written a book called, I think, American Mania, when more isn't enough. And Warren had said to me that his wife, who was a psychoanalyst, Grace was her name,
Mm-hmm.
she was really a fan of that book. And I said, well, I know Peter. I'm at UCLA, a professor. Let's have lunch. And I was like a fly on the wall of two great people. And, and people open up to each other. And Warren said, I don't think I've done enough in the world. And I said, why? He said, my whole life has been about leadership. And leaders are getting increasingly worse. They're not getting better. Yes, some of them, and I felt like it was like a Schindler moment, like Schindler's List. I could have done more. And I'm just listening to the pain. And then Peter Wybrow, head of UCLA, and he said, I feel the same. He said, our department runs on research, pharmacological research. And he said, did you know that the United States prescribes more stimulants, like Adderall, than the rest of the world combined? And I'm a Brit. And sometimes I'm thinking what we should tell students is just focus. But no, we have all these meds. And the pain between them was palpable. Mm. And then I think I pulled one of my power plays. So afterwards, I sent them both an email. I said, I am here to tell you that I forbid you to beat up on yourselves, because the world is a better place because of both of you. And you have less control over the results than of trying and never quitting. And both of you have tried and never quit. And at this stage of your lives, I don't give you permission to beat up on yourselves.
Mm.
So I could see how he would like the world to have more grace. And it's like you said, what he wanted to be remembered for on his tombstone is generous conversations.
Mm.
I think beyond that, he would have said, maybe I would have liked to have left the world a little more gracious.
Mm.
So, and I'm sure that's true. But I'll share another story, and then I just have lots of stories.
Oh yeah, that's great.
So at one point, I was coaching the CEO of Concord Jazz Records, and they were the top independent jazz label ever. They did the Ray Charles Duets album that won all the awards, and one of the co-owners or founders of Concord Record was Norman Lear, who did All in the Family.
Oh, sure.
And Norman and Warren, had a mutual admiration. And so we arranged a dinner with the CEO of Concord Records, Glenn Barros, Norman, and Warren. And we're at a restaurant. And, I'm just listening to just two of them. And I said, what's your greatest fear for the future? And Warren looked at Norman, and Norman looked at Warren. And Warren said to me, one word, expediency. He said, when people rush, they do stupid stuff. And that rush is my worry for the future, is that people are in such a rush, they're not going to make the best decisions, for humankind.
Well, it seems like expediency is maybe one of the things that you're fighting in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely. I'll share something, and I blog a lot. I wake up, I blog, and I have an axe to grind with Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, Jeff Bezos. Everyone, I give a pass to Satya Nadella, because Satya had a son who died. Satya is the only head who has an empathy chip. And to go along with expediency, I think the other people I mentioned, I shouldn't say this, but I'll say it anyway, they could be a little bit on the spectrum, meaning they are focused on goals. They don't really relate to people. They don't do closeness. They do ambition and goals. And I think they have addicted the world to adrenaline, dopamine, and testosterone. And what's happened is there's another hormone, oxytocin, which is almost extinct. And oxytocin is what fuels intimacy. And the cardinal features of oxytocin are patience, tenderness, compassion. And I think what happened is technology has addicted the world to excitement instead of joy, to impatience, to expediency. And it worries me.
So you might get a kick out of this. I don't know if anybody's ever called you this before, but I was actually going to call you like a modern day Fred Rogers because of your use of media. I mean, your use of media to get your ideas and thoughts out there, I think is really admirable. I mean, you're on these radio shows, you're blogging, you're doing your wake up podcast. I don't know if I read this the wrong way, but you've in some cases done some plays, like you've done some acts, like the Steve
Yeah,
Jobs work. And
yeah. So here, wait, so forget all that mushy stuff I just said. Let me just pivot into Steve Jobs
okay,
because your listeners will say, "Oh, that was really cool." Well, the other,
yeah,
okay, but
the
this is
mushy stuff's good too. The
the
mushy
mushy
stuff
stuff.
is good too. We'll leave
So
it in there.
so I did a one-man show
Hmm.
that I wrote, directed, played. It was just me, called Steve Jobs Returns. And I probably performed it 15, 18 times, maybe 20. Uh, and I had the turtleneck, I had the glasses, I had the 501 jeans, I had the New Balance. I mean, I was decked up like Steve Jobs. And the whole purpose of it was that I discovered the secret formula for how to think like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. And I created a whole show around it. And here's the formula. And I learned it because I was speaking to CEO groups, entrepreneur groups, and I was talking about, I think this is the secret of Apple. And one of the groups said, no, it's the secret of Steve Jobs. And then I started reading up on Steve Jobs. And then what happened is I started to morph over in the presentations into telling anecdotes about Steve Jobs and then to playing Steve Jobs. And one of the entrepreneurs came up to me and they said, you have to make a choice. You can either inform us or you can do infotainment and become him. And he smiled at me and he said, I know what you're going to choose. and and I do have this ability to sort of see the world from other people's points of view, which I think may have helped me to get through to suicidal people. And so here's the formula. And if you're watching this and listening, write this down. And the formula is, what I do is I show a video of Steve Jobs. And if you search National Geographic, Xerox PARC, Steve Jobs, you'll see a reenactment of Steve Jobs discovering the mouse and the graphical user interface at Xerox PARC. And it's a 2-minute video, and you will see the expressions in his eyes, these 4 distinct expressions. Right, so write this down. Whoa, WHOA, I can't believe what I'm seeing. So in that video, he's cynical, arrogant Steve Jobs, and he sees the mouse and the graphical user interface, and he leans forward, and the whoa, I can't believe what I just saw. And then he says to the technician, can I try it? And then when he tries it in this video, he starts to sweat. And so that's wow. So whoa is I can't believe what I just saw. Wow is that's amazing, that's astonishing, that's unbelievable. And then in the video, he looks back at Steve Wozniak, who was kind of his thinker. And Steve Wozniak comes into the video and says, I told Steve that once they go there, they're not going back. They're not going back to typing when they can use a mouse. So that's, And so what Steve Jobs thinks is, this is too good to ignore. This is too good to not steal. And then the end of the video is Walter Isaacson coming on all in 2 minutes saying they didn't know what to do with this at Xerox. But Steve Jobs went back to Apple and they created the Macintosh. So, whoa, I can't believe what I just saw. Wow, that's amazing, astonishing, unbelievable. That's too good not to use. Yes, sold. And what happened is he converted the entire way that Apple and Elon Musk make presentations. You know, it's a phone, it's an internet connecting device, it's an iPad. And these are not three separate devices. I give you the iPhone. That's a whoa, wow, yes.
It's I feel like it makes me think of Simon Sinek's Start With Why, but it's different, certainly different. You've mentioned that you can do this in conversations, right? Like you can do this in conversations with people.
Well, totally. In fact, what happened, I met with David Wan. He was the former CEO of all of Harvard Business Publishing, and his head of global publishing, Josh Mock, and I met with him in Cambridge. And I forget what we were talking about, but when I mentioned whoa, wow, yes, they both spontaneously took out a piece of paper and wrote it down. And then on a separate meeting, I met with Art Kleiner, who was the former editor-in-chief of Strategy and Business. Met with him in New York. We're having a conversation. I mentioned whoa, wow, yes. They write it down. So whoa, wow, yes is a whoa, wow, yes.
It speaks for itself.
And if you're listening, by the way, you want to market anything? And by the way, when you do your edits of this program, what you really want to do with people, the viewers, the listeners, the funders of the Institute, you want to create in them, whoa, wow, yes, we got to support the Institute.
I have actually some questions that fit into that formula. I know we're running close to time, but I think these are the whoa, wow, yes questions. So just building on what you said about corporations. So I think you were starting to share with me some of what you're noticing in organizations with your coaching today. Is that fair to say, like the examples that you were giving of the larger corporations that are kind of depleting levels of attention and oxytocin? I mean, maybe that's not indicative of everything you're seeing in organizations, but it did make me think about, especially with the Facebook example, the impact on mental health, which I know is your space, and specifically, it makes me think of our younger, the youth of today, and the impact of youth. And there's a lot of, one of my mentors has shared, there's a lot of literature, leadership literature geared towards executives, but she posed the question, what are we doing to develop younger leaders? And I wonder if I'd like to couch that question like in the context of life today. The United States being prescribing more, what did you say? Adderall type drugs, the competition for attention through these social media companies, et cetera. So I would like to couch that question of what are we doing for younger leaders? And I think a lot of your work is water in the desert for some younger leaders. But how would you respond to that? I know you're doing some work with teenagers and families now.
Well, I coach a lot of people on how to be more compelling, which opens people's minds to you, which earns you the right to then be convincing to try to get them to take action. And the problem with a lot of startups that love their IP is they start by being convincing too soon. And people smile like this, and it's not a yes. The smile is you're being too pushy. And when I coach people on making presentations, I say, this is how you engage people. Here's the magic formula. What the people are listening for is, and this is the best and most engaging first impression you can make. Their first impression of you is, how did you know that about me? So you get where they're coming from without their telling you. How did you know that about me? And you then present something where they say, I never would have thought of that. And then they think, I think that could work. And then what you end is you give them a taste of something they can do immediately that works 100% of the time. And the taste should be, the bigger meal is your service or your product. But does that make sense kind of psychologically? Like, how'd you know that about me? What else do you know about me? And they're not being paranoid. They're just, how did you know that about me? And then what happens is, tell me more, because you get where I'm coming from. And then they're thinking, I never would have thought of that. And so part of what I do, and I'm trying to make Hurt Less, Live More, a meme for the world, is that when you're with people, and I don't care whether it's business or your personal life, if you realize that everybody's hurting about something, everybody's afraid of something, and they want to race away from it into some activity, and because you want to race away from your hurt or fear, you collude with them. And together you go play a video game. Together you go, to some rave concert, and you've escaped it temporarily. But what I'm wanting to encourage people through our radio show, we hope, is that when you're with someone, and this won't be easy, drop your transactional, what's in it for me mindset. And then see what you pick up. In my book, Just Listen, one of the favorite anecdotes in there, I was trying to meet with a CEO, and he said, and he was restless, and he was going through his papers, and it was clear that he didn't want me there. But I'm feisty. And so imagine this, a busy CEO who doesn't even want to talk to you. And I said, hey, how much time you got for me? He looks at me. I said, yeah, look at your calendar. How much time you got for me? And he looks at his calendar with a look that says, your time's just about up, buddy. And he said, 20 minutes. And I said, we're into minute 3, and I think what we were going to talk about is worth your undivided attention, but you can't give it to me because your mind's on something else. So here's the deal. Let's cancel the meeting. Take care of whatever's on your mind. We'll reschedule this, or you can tell your assistant, never let the guy back in the building. But take care of what's on your mind in the next 16 minutes, because it's not fair to yourself. You're not here. You're not with me. And it's not fair to anyone else. And he looks at me and he starts to tear up. And he said, you know something that people 30 yards from us don't know, because I'm very private. He said, my wife's having a biopsy and it doesn't look good. And I said, be with her. You're not here. Go, leave, go on, take care of it, make a call. This is not important. And then he's looking at me and he shakes his shoulders. He was a former football player. He goes, and then he looks at me and he said, I'm not as tough as my wife. I'm pretty tough. I served in Vietnam. And you've got your full 20 minutes and you've got my undivided attention. So can you see the power? And what does this have to do with teenagers? Is if you listen in to anybody and you pick up something isn't right, For crying out loud, let go of your agenda and say, can I put something aside? And they're going to say, what? Something's distracting you. Something big's distracting you. Can you tell me what it is? Because it's likely to be more important than whatever we talked about.
Dr. Mark, I know we're at our time. I can't help but ask this final question. Do you, I read somewhere along the lines that if we had more people in our lives, family, friends included, who truly just listened to us, to use your language, and knew that they could come to us, we wouldn't have as much of a need for, I mean, granted, there is such a place for professional therapy, but like, what is that line between, like being present to someone and applying this surgical empathy, being healing oriented towards the relationships in your life, and sort of that professional help? Because I feel like there could be this thought of like, it's not my role as a friend or a family member to fix you, but it is my role, I would think, as I reflect on my life, it is my role to listen to someone and to be present to someone. Does that make sense?
I'm not keen on mental health resources because they're few and far between, and 90% of people are on a waiting list, and you're on a waiting list for your kid who you think might be depressed or suicidal, and they can't see someone for a month. So I'm really big on teaching parents and the people they love, and husbands and wives, how to have better conversations. And one of the projects that I'm passionate about is with a friend of mine, Jason Reed. His 14-year-old son died by suicide 5 years ago. He left a suicide note that said, "Tell my story." And so Jason created an Amazon Prime documentary, "Tell My Story." And he researched it and he spoke to experts, and I was one of the experts, and that's how we got to know each other. And the most powerful part of it is when he spoke to teenagers about their low point. So he's created a video called "What I Wish My Parents Knew," because it's what he wished he'd known, but he was too late. And he interviews 10 teenagers about their low point. It's mesmerizing. We're not going to put it on YouTube or Netflix because the haters would rip these teenagers apart. And so our mission is to present it to 500 high schools and then colleges and then companies, because when parents watch these teenagers just being honest and open and raw, but calm, they see their teenagers in them. And when parents see this, they go back to their teens and they're crying, and their teenager says, "What, Mom? What, Dad?" And the parents say, "I just realized how much I love you." And one of the things we talk about, if you're a parent, is the 5 things that teens do that trigger parents to be unempathic are complain, blame, excuses, threats, moody. Complain, blame, excuses, threats, moody. Because when your teenager is this way, which most of them are most of the time, it triggers you to react. What's going on? I'm fine. Leave me alone. And so these teenagers talk about how they couldn't open up to their parents. And one of the reasons teenagers don't open up to their parents is they see their parents as unempathic. And what teenagers don't realize is one of the reasons their parents are unempathic is they're not opening up to their parents about the pain and hurt and fear underneath. And instead, they complain, blame, excuse, threats, and they're moody. So I've been looking for a vehicle to change conversations, especially between parents and teens, for 25 years. And this is it. This is it.
There was a conference that I was just at in Washington, D.C. Actually, you'll appreciate this. I got to see David Gergen there, heard him speak, and picked up a copy of his latest book, hearts touched with fire, or hearts touched by fire, how great leaders are made. And one of the memorable lines from not Mr. Gergen's presentation, but another presentation was, the seeds of leadership are born in family. And I just really, and I love Warren's definition of leadership. Leadership is synonymous with becoming yourself. So the seeds of leadership being born in family. So just really drawn to your thoughts on connectivity at the home, the importance of conversations.
Well, here's a little David Gergen thing that. So I went to Warren's memorial service at USC. It was huge, and because my relationship with him, was under the radar. I wasn't one of the speakers, but David Gergen was. And what really struck me, David Gergen is strong. He is, he's not emotional. But in the memorial service, and I think you can find it on Vimeo, Warren Bennis memorial service, and they may have edited it, but one of the things David Gergen said is, I want to bring my son Christopher up. So Chris Gergen goes up. And David says, Warren was a mentor to each of us. And because of his mentorship to each of us, Chris and I have had conversations that we needed to have but never had. And David got a little emotional. David Gergen does not get emotional. Blew me away.